Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're here to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts on global warming and climate change, state of the climate. What's been happening over the last year? Now, our climate is determined by patterns of temperature, wind, atmospheric pressure, humidity, and rain over a long period of time. There are different climates all around the world, such as tropical, dry, and moderate. And of course, here in the U.S., we have a variety of climates. The climate of an area determines its seasons and when they come and when they go. And this, in turn, of course, affects the type of plants that grow and which animals can survive here. The species and places we love depend on intricate ecosystems, and even small changes to the climate can disrupt this very delicate balance of nature. As humans, each and every aspect of our life is reliant on the natural environment. This includes the food we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the clothes we wear, and the products that are made and sold to create the jobs that drive our economy. So obviously, a healthy and stable climate is our very most precious natural resource. But there are many changes to the climate that humans are causing, and this is being caused through global warming. Global warming caused by greenhouse gas pollution is causing immediate and direct changes to the planet. And all of this has a great ongoing and increasing effect on the health of our planet and our health. And here today to help us unpack this is Professor Jeff Shaman. Jeff is a professor in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences and director of the Climate and Health Program at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. He studies the survival, transmission, and ecology of infectious agents, including the effects of hydrological conditions on these processes. Work to date has primarily focused on mosquito-borne and respiratory pathogens. He uses mathematical and statistical models to describe, understand, and forecast the transmission dynamics of these disease systems and to investigate the broader effects of climate and weather on human health. Welcome, Jeff. We're so glad that you could join us today.
Thank you for having me, Bernice. It's a pleasure being here.
Jeff, you described climate change as destabilizing our bodies and our planet. So can you tell our listeners about exactly how this happens and how have things changed over the last year or the last few years as it relates to this destabilization?
Well, I would say that you could take it back even farther than that. As you alluded to, we really depend on the climate system for everything that we have here. It's how we have reliable wet water resources. It's how we have food security. We're able to grow our crops because of it. And all the plants and ecosystem services that ultimately feed into human commerce and what we do are reliant on a stable climate system. I think if we were to take a really long view on this, which I sometimes ask my students to do, you could go back 10, 11,000 years when we came out of the last ice age. We entered a very stable period of climate called the Holocene. For the last 11,000 years, our Earth system's climate has been remarkably stable compared to what it was the previous 800,000 years when we were cycling through these ice sheets that covered much of North America and Eurasia, and colder temperatures struck the globe for periods of time and then warmer. During this very stable period, though, that we've had the 11,000 years, I don't think it's any accident that we've set up agriculture, that the Fertile Crescent arose in the Middle East, And we started to settle down and form cities and civilizations and begin to develop all the modern accoutrements that we see today. And it's because of that stable climate system that we've been able to do that. If things aren't reliable, if you're not going to have temperatures and rainfall that allow you to grow crops in a reliable way, you can't stay in one place. You're going to have to be on the move. Populations can't grow and civilization can't thrive. So if we fast forward now to the Industrial Revolution, 250 years ago, we started to extract fossil fuels from the ground and burn them at much greater rates, adding all these greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and in changing the composition of the trace gases that contribute to the greenhouse effect. This has accelerated over time, so much so that over the last 50 years, and now even more so, I would say over the last 20 years, we've seen a real departure in temperatures. We've radically increased those greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We're getting close to being doubling them. We're going to hit that in the next decades or two. And furthermore, with doing that, we've pushed the temperatures at a very alarming rate, really quickly. This destabilization is something that we're not really capable and ready to deal with because it's changing the hydrologic regimes, it's changing our exposure to heat and humidity levels, it's changing the things that not only directly impact human health, but indirectly impact our well-being through shifting infectious disease patterns, changes in food security, and loss of water resources.
Tell me again what you call the name of that very stable period we were in.
It's called the Holocene. It's the period when we came out of the last glacial cycle, the last ice age, and it's a period of roughly the last 11,000 years during which the climate system has been fairly stable until the last 100 years. So
now we are clearly out of that very stable period now, though, right?
We are moving ourselves away from it. And we're not only doing it, we're doing it at an alarming rate. We need to rethink how we are getting our energy. And we have the tools available to us right now. If we were to really go all in and develop the technologies, there is ample resources available to really extract the energy that we need from solar, wind, and even wave power. The question, though, is are we willing to make the investments to set up that infrastructure so that we can move off the fossil fuels and onto something that's more sustainable and that will keep our planet cleaner?
Indeed. Jeff, climate change, of course, impacts our health at all levels. And that's what this show is about, is to sensitize people from that focus or from that door so they do understand that to be concerned about the environment and climate change is really not an option. Again, it's existential. Let's first zero in on the environmental disasters and their connection to human health.
Well, we see a lot of disasters of late, and particularly in the United States, we've seen a very severe hurricane season this year. Now, there have been severe hurricane seasons in the past, but what we're expecting with climate change is that we're going to have more of them, that we're going to have more intense hurricanes making landfall. Another big thing that actually affects us that is in terms of these extreme events are, of course, the fires that we see out in the West Coast. Those fires out in the West Coast obviously can come from natural or human causes. Somebody has to light a fire, or there's a lightning strike, or something has to happen. But the conditions that allow those fires to really take off and expand and cause the damage that they are is being exacerbated by climate change. It's resulting in a larger drying out of the vegetation, which makes them more prone to supporting fires and actually allowing them to spread further than we've seen previously. So for instance, this year, California has had its largest fire on record, and certainly the entire West Coast has seen a record-breaking season in terms of the amount of acreage that has been burned.
Can you help us a little bit, and this is going into your expertise in viruses and infectious diseases. Mm-hmm. How does global warming and some of the weather impacts and other disasters you just talked about, how do these impact trends and our risk of contracting infectious diseases? How do these impact our health?
Well, that's actually a very complex question. And to get into it, you have to start picking individual diseases. Is it mosquito-borne? Is it a respiratory virus? What's happening with it? Now, we could pick those apart, but it may be better to think about, when you think about the larger health effects of what's going on, I like to break it down into those that are direct effects due to climate change. That might be due to increased storms or fires that are going to have blunt force trauma or smoke inhalation issues associated with them, as well as heat wave events that cause heat-related morbidity and mortality. Then you have things that are indirect, and those are the infectious diseases. And the changes in the climate system are going to change the viability and the transmissibility of pathogens, where they're being transmitted, particularly ones that have what are called vectors, which are insects or invertebrates that act as the agents for transferring a pathogen between hosts. So a mosquito is a vector of disease. It transfers a virus or a pathogen such as malaria from person to person. Now, those mosquitoes themselves are affected by weather and climate change. And so that is a big factor that affects into. Certainly hurricanes can do it as well, because that can result in a bloom of mosquitoes or respiratory viruses running wild. So you need to break it down, as it were. But what we're seeing is a disruption from the climate system. Remember, we talked about the stability of the Holocene? What we're seeing is a destabilization of our systems such that people who weren't otherwise exposed to certain diseases are. And when you haven't been exposed to them regularly, you're usually not prepared for them. So they can have devastating consequences.
Which leads us to our current situation, which we will talk about much more on the other side of the break. We've been with Professor Jeffrey Shaman. We'll be right back with you on the other side. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX TV streaming services. For EarthX, Earth Day is every day. So join the movement, keep in touch, and add to the conversation at EarthX League. Go to their website, earthx.org, to register and start talking. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods grocers, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, as well as online, available for free download at nadallas.com. Check them out. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. And we're back with Professor Jeffrey Shaman with the Department of Environmental Health Sciences and Director of Climate and Health Program at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Again, we're so glad you could join us today, Jeff.
Thank you again for having me, Bernice.
Now, you had given us a very fascinating and very, I think, significantly understandable explanation of how climate change can drive viruses and infectious disease. So now, though, we want to start this segment with talking about what's on all of our minds, and that is COVID. And what is the connection and relationship of COVID and climate change?
I think fundamentally I can come out and say that the emergence of COVID-19 in almost all likelihood has almost nothing to do with climate change itself. It certainly has a lot to do with deforestation, animal use and animal practices, waste management, encroachment on natural environments, and sustainability. It has a lot to do with a lot of other environmental issues that allow people to come in contact with animals, to trade them, to bring them into contact with other animals and humans, and to allow a mixing of viruses that might result in some sort of assortment or mutation that arises that's capable of actually infecting humans and engaging in the sustained transmission that we see. Now, while it's not involved in the emergence of this disease, we do see that there is some likelihood that climate affects the transmissibility of this virus. So one of the key things that we know is that the influenza virus, which is a different virus, and we get flu all the time, is very seasonal. And this is something that's been observed for 2,500 years, believe it or not, long before they even knew what flu was. Flu was only identified about 90 years ago. But they recognized that there was this respiratory ailment that people got in the wintertime for those who lived outside of tropical regions. And they've documented this, they've wrote about it, and of course it's accelerated since they've actually identified the flu pathogen. And what we found out is that this virus tends to transmit more during the wintertime. We all know that, right? We get the flu during the wintertime. That is the cold and flu season as we talk about it here in the US. Now, there are three hypotheses for why this occurs. One has to do with changes in how people mix. During the wintertime, people spend more time indoors, schools are in session, and that person-to-person contact facilitates the transmission of the virus. The second has to do with changes in our immune function, which when there's less light, we may have less vitamin D and melatonin production, and it may suppress our immune response. So we may be more susceptible to infection and more capable of passing it on to someone else. But the third idea has to do with weather conditions. And that is that during the wintertime, there may be conditions that actually make the virus more viable once it's expelled from a host. So when you have a respiratory virus, you shed it in your oral and nasal mucosa. When you speak or breathe or cough or sneeze, you expel droplets that are filled with the virus. Some of them aerosolize, some of them land on surfaces, some of them may hit a person. But it's by that expulsion of it that you're putting the virus out in the environment that somebody else can then pick it up. While it's outside the host, viruses sometimes are very sensitive to ambient conditions. And it turns out it looks like flu is very sensitive to humidity conditions and a certain type of humidity. It's called the absolute humidity, which is the amount of water vapor in the air. Now, we don't know quite why that is, but we do know that during the wintertime, both indoors and outdoors, humidity, this absolute humidity, is very low, and the virus survives very well in that environment. So it appears that the virus is capable of surviving longer in the wintertime, and it's more transmissible as a result, and we get these outbreaks in the wintertime. So what does this have to do with COVID? Well, COVID has 4 cousins that are also coronaviruses that we get all the time. They have funny alphanumeric names like OC43 and HKU1. They're what's called these endemic coronaviruses, and they cause very mild colds. They don't cause as much trouble, but they're related to COVID-19. And we get them all the time, and it turns out they have the same seasonality. They occur when flu occurs in the wintertime. So people have looked at flu and said, well, this seems to be driven by humidity conditions. And they see that, well, there are these endemic coronaviruses that also have the same cycle. We haven't studied them the same way, but maybe they also are affected by humidity because they're doing the same thing flu is. And then we get this new virus, this big problem that is our pandemic. And it is related to these other coronaviruses. So by another step of logic, it says, is this virus seasonal? Now, what that would mean is that the virus is more transmissible. This COVID-19 virus, which is called SARS-CoV-2. Obviously, we had a lot of problems during the summertime with this virus. In the height of summer, Texas, Florida, Arizona, Southern California, tons of cases of coronavirus. So what gives? Why would there be any sort of seasonality? Well, the evidence that's coming out seems to suggest that, in fact, the virus is less transmissible during summer. So we were exposed enough to it. We had little immunity against it. We were susceptible at a very high level because it's a new virus, which makes it very efficient. Furthermore, this virus, this COVID-19, it's actually more transmissible than the flu is. So even though it has this seasonality that makes it less transmissible in the summer, it wasn't enough to stop it. And it wasn't enough to stop it in places like Texas in August, or Florida in August, or California, or even Brazil, in tropical Brazil, right on the equator. But our concern is this. We're now going into colder times. The virus is going to be more transmissible, and people are going to spend more time indoors. And certain places are opening restaurants fully, indoor dining, and schools are reopening, and universities have reopened. And if we put all those things together, are we building a recipe for disaster? Because we're doing a lot of things that ostensibly are favoring the virus and giving it more opportunities to go from person to person. And that's what the virus thrives off. So where weather and climate come in is the cycle of it, that seasonal cycle. And the evidence isn't airtight yet, but we will see this more definitively over the next few months, unfortunately. But it appears preliminarily that the wintertime may be more favorable for the transmission of this virus.
But you know, Jeff, I am just so ever thankful that we have people like you who study this stuff. There's a lot of factors. And so we are thankful for people like you who study this so that we can know and figure out the combination of all the factors so that we know what to do, we can know what to do to protect ourselves. The other question that comes to my mind based upon your explanation is that climate change also has an effect on our seasons. So while we don't have it down pat yet, the seasonality or the seasonal impacts and influences on coronavirus, we do on some other things. So how might the impact of climate change on seasons affect some of our disease patterns or diseases that we know?
So for respiratory diseases, so think about flu. So flu has this strong seasonal cycle. And so the question is, if Chicago looks a lot more like Dallas with global warming, Chicago has a seasonal cycle of flu, but so does Dallas. So Chicago's not going to see much change, probably, one could argue. But someplace like Miami starts to look more like Bogota, right, in the deep tropics, and really gets warmer. Maybe there will be a breakdown in its seasonality, and we'll see a different pattern of flu.
Indeed. And we only have a little while to go, and we already know that we're going to have you back on a number of more times to learn more from you and get more conversation about what you actually do. So because you're very good, I think, at explaining it and connecting the dots for listeners, and that's what we're about as a show. So last thing before we go, and that is, what change can everyday people make in their lives to help protect their health and the planet as it relates to these environmentally related viruses and infections and diseases?
Oh, well, the relationships to the diseases. So, I'm sure you've talked about co-benefits, how the more you walk, the less you burn fossil fuels and the better it is for your health because you're actually walking. And those are the types of things that we really like to point to. I think for something like this, I think it's important to be mindful of when mosquitoes are out, for instance. If you're in North Texas as you're based there and you're going out to play and it's outside on a summer's day and the mosquitoes are out because it's dusk, you might not want to do that, or you might want to cover up in a way that's a little less comfortable thermally, but protects you from mosquito bites so you can avoid West Nile virus. It's to be mindful of those environmental conditions and take advantage of them. The other thing I would say is empty your bird baths. If you're worried about those Aedes mosquitoes that transmit things like dengue, chikungunya, and Zika, don't have water baths out there just standing around. Empty your flower pots. Don't let standing water exist in your yard. That's a breeding ground for those mosquitoes.
Yeah, the news people tell us that every day during this time of year. It's like I decided not to put my trash out in the alleyway last night at dusk, but rather I waited till about 10 o'clock this morning to do it. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jeff. We've been with Professor Jeffrey Shaman from Columbia University, and he's been making us all much smarter as it relates to climate change, global warming, the effect on our health. Thank you. We'll be right back on the other side from the health perspective. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. Today's show on global warming and climate change. And we're back to talk more about what's been going on over the last year. And we want to talk now from the health perspective. Now, Earth's temperature has already warmed by 1 degree Celsius or 33 degrees Fahrenheit, which is how we usually refer to it, compared to pre-industrial levels. This temperature rise may appear small, but small rises in temperature translate into really big changes for the world's climate. This is because the amount of extra energy needed to increase the world's temperature, even by little, is vast. And this extra energy is like force feeding the global climate system. It results in hotter days. Since 2015, every previous year's record has been broken, with 2019 being the second hottest year on record in Earth's history. As well, the past few years' records have seen broken records for the longest heat waves, and the Bureau of Meteorology has added purple and magenta to the forecast map for temperatures up to 129.2 degrees. It's also resulted in rising sea levels, and increased ocean temperatures are melting glaciers and ice caps all over the world. Melted ice increases the volume of water in our oceans, And warmer temperatures also result in the expansion of the water's mass, which causes sea levels to rise, threatening low-lying islands and coastal cities already like Miami and many other areas. And it results in more frequent and intense extreme weather events. Extreme weather events like bushfires, cyclones, droughts, and floods are becoming almost commonplace with more intense global warming. And these are just among many other things that are happening. And as we discussed in our previous part of our show with Professor Jeff Shaman, all of this has significant health consequences. And here today now to help us understand this more from the health perspective is Dr. Samantha Adhoot. Dr. Adhoot is board certified with the American Board of Pediatrics, and she is a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics since 2002. She joined Pediatric Associates of Alexandria in 2003. That's in Virginia. And she is an assistant professor of pediatrics at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine, Inova campus, as well as an attending physician at Inova Alexandria and Fairfax hospitals. Dr. Adhoot served as a member of the executive committee of the AAP's Council on Environmental Health. She is a spokesperson for the AAP, again, that's the Attending Physicians Association, on climate change impacts on children, and she was the lead author of their policy statement on climate change in children's health, published in November 2015. She is also chair and co-founder of Virginia Clinicians for Climate Action. Welcome, Dr. Adhoot. We are so glad you could join us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to speak to your audience today.
Thank you. May I call you Samantha?
Please do.
Samantha, can you help our listeners connect the dots as it relates to the effects of climate change on their health? What framework can you provide for them to make this connection so that they can really get it? And I'm sure this is something you do every day with your patients that you see.
Absolutely. You know, I think people generally know that the climate affects health. It's something that we learn intuitively from the time we're very young. In the wintertime, we get the flu, we get colds. In the spring, when the plants start to bloom, we get allergies. In the summer, when mosquitoes start coming out or ticks, we can get mosquito-borne infections like West Nile disease, or we can get tick-borne infections like Lyme disease. So as the climate is changing, as the winters are milder and not as cold, as the spring is coming earlier, as the summer is getting hotter and extending longer, all of the illnesses that are associated that are inherently linked with climate, they also start to shift. So we start to see allergies coming a little earlier than they used to in the past because the plants are blooming earlier. We start to see heat illness and mosquito-borne illness becoming a problem later in the year when it used to be cooler. And we also see other effects from the other changes that you were discussing. For example, more heavy rainfall can change the organisms, the bacteria that grow in our water supply, can compromise our ability to keep our food and water safe. More extreme weather can also disrupt the health system altogether and make it hard for us to deliver the health care that we've gotten so good at delivering. So I like to think of it's a question really of just alerting people to the pretty basic understandings that they already have.
And I know here in North Texas, we are now almost year-round allergy season. It used to be mountain cedar was this period of time, then elm was this period of time, and then something else. And now they're all merging in together, and it is because of temperature changes.
It's happening across the world as plants are moving into areas where they didn't used to grow, or they're growing in times of the year that they didn't used to grow. The allergy season is shifting.
Yet at the very basic level, I think people can understand is the climate change is causing a shift in the seasons.
That's right.
And we knew well before climate change or anything else what the seasons bring. It seems like, too, Samantha, that it's us allergy sufferers who are on the front line of all of this, right?
Well, allergies are an interesting way to view climate change because, on the one hand, the plants are blooming at different times, but also we have put a lot more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is one of the air pollutants that comes from burning fuels like coal, oil, and gas, and it's actually one of the most important gases that traps heat, which is causing our planet to warm. But carbon dioxide is also plant food. It is the substrate, it is the basic food for photosynthesis. And so as we're giving plants more food, many plants are making more pollen. So plants like ragweed, which here in Virginia is causing a lot of our allergies right now. Plants like oak, grass pollen. Many studies now have shown over the past 20 years that higher CO2 causes these plants to make more pollen.
That's interesting. I had not heard that before, but certainly makes sense that global warming, climate change is adding to more pollen. Now, are we talking about just more pollen in terms of volume, or are we talking about its potency, or both?
That's an interesting question. There actually is evidence of both. One of the studies that's cited the most is how CO2 is affected poison ivy composition. Now, poison ivy is not doesn't cause symptoms because of pollen, but like pollen, it has proteins which cause us to have allergic reactions to the poison ivy plant. And in fact, what's been shown is that higher CO2 not only can shift which proteins are produced by the plant and can cause the plant to produce more of the protein, which causes us to itch and have reactions to it.
That's interesting, very interesting. Samantha, though, talk to us a little bit, too, about what you are seeing in terms of illnesses in your office every day. What's the connection? What impacts of climate change on illnesses are you really seeing every day?
So one of the effects that I'm seeing the most is the effects of our hotter temperatures. In Virginia, July was the hottest July that Virginia has ever recorded. I understand that in Dallas, you've also had only record high temperatures in 2020. And so you're experiencing similar warming temperatures. But in my practice, I care for a lot of newborns. And we actually had a lot of newborn babies this summer.
Yeah. The COVID baby boom.
I think so. It's been a very busy summer for newborns. Mm-hmm. But when I counsel parents with their newborns, this summer I had to really be quite conscious of warning them of the risk of taking newborns outside when it's too hot. Newborn infants are the second highest risk group to high temperatures. The people that are most vulnerable to extreme heat are our grandparents, elderly population, and newborns. Also, our student athletes, our high school football players who are in preseason training in August, our young military recruits, and outdoor workers. But in my practice as a pediatrician, I've been very conscious this summer of warning patients how to protect their babies.
Thank you so much. I got so wrapped up in what you were saying, I almost forgot to go to break. We've been with Dr. Samantha Adhoot, and we will be right back on the other side of the break for her to educate us some more. Thank you.
Welcome.
We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors, that is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX TV streaming service. For EarthX, Earth Day is every day. So join the movement, keep in touch, and add to their conversation at EarthX League. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, as well as available online for free download at nadallas.com. Check them out. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, and today's show on global warming and climate change, the state of the climate. And we are back with Dr. Samantha Adhoot, and she is really giving us an education on some of the health impacts of climate change and the state of things and what she is seeing in her practice there in Alexandria, Virginia. Again, thank you so much, Samantha, for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Now, before the break, you were telling us that a lot of what you were seeing every day in your clinical practice as it relates to climate change was around heat and newborn. Are there any other things that you're seeing as it relates to diseases or anything?
Yes. So one of the other things that's happening across the country and the world is an increase in tick-borne infections. There's been a dramatic rise in tick-borne infections across the United States. That includes Lyme disease, other tick-borne infections, including things like ehrlichiosis or spotted fevers. But these infections are occurring in places that they didn't really used to occur. Like one of the areas that's been affected the most is the northern part of our country, like New England. So in June, I saw a baby, 18-month-old boy, and he'd been to Maine with his family. Now, in 1980, if you went to Maine, you didn't get Lyme disease. It almost never happened. But now it's happening a lot. And this baby came back to my office after his trip, and he had a rash on his chest. And it was the Lyme disease rash, which he had gotten in Maine. And it didn't used to be too cold, and I treated him with an antibiotic, and he recovered completely. We've seen several other children this summer with Lyme disease, with the neurologic complications of Lyme disease, a paralysis of the face, which is thankfully transient and goes away with treatment. So those children have done fine. But as places are warming, ticks can survive where it used to be too cold. So if you go to Canada now to visit in the summertime, you've got to be very aware of protecting yourself. Whereas, again, in 1980, there were no ticks living in Canada. It was too cold. But now those northern places have a lot of ticks, and those ticks have brought with them infections like Lyme disease.
Interesting. And it also seems as though you all up north are getting more water, flooding.
Oh, yes.
Water events than you used to. Is that causing any impacts?
Oh, goodness. Well, my city has been very affected by that. We're a city on a river. We're a historic city on the Potomac River.
Right.
And we have one of the oldest water systems. We have combined stormwater and sewage in our city, unfortunately. So in the past 14 months, we've had 4 100-year floods. And when this happens, our floodwaters are combined rain and sewage. So this contaminated water has gotten into the homes of my patients, and it's in the streets and on the lawns. And I've seen now just this past summer 2 children with severe bacterial infections of the intestines with bloody stool and high fevers, and which could be related to this contamination from our heavy rainfall combined with sewage.
It's affecting us in a number of ways. Samantha, though, I want to turn to you to talk to us a little bit about the connection and the common thread of science and climate change and medicine. And how is this playing out, perhaps, in health policy?
Well, I think physicians the way we're trained is very much similar to the way other scientists are trained, in that there are experts, for example, in medicine at the CDC, at the National Institute of Health, and they guide us. They guide us about what is the best practice, what is happening, how do I, as a general pediatrician, practice, take care of my patients, what shots do I give at what time. Mm-hmm. We trust these organizations to guide us. And the same is true in the health of our planet. But what's happening is our policymakers aren't always trusting our scientific leaders, and trusting their advice. And I think of it, if doctors didn't trust our scientific advisors, every doctor would practice completely differently. They'd just make it up. So every pediatrician would make up their own shot schedule, or would make up, I'll just give you a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And that's not how we practice. We practice through the advice of our experts. And we need to follow our experts when it comes to the health of our planet, and understand that they know and they understand what our planet needs to keep it healthy. So I would say that's the direction we need to shift towards, is trusting our scientific leaders.
We ended up doing a whole show on the effects of the environment and climate change on children. And I don't know why that tends to escape people, that children are our vulnerable population, perhaps the most important of our vulnerable populations, because they are our future.
It's so true. And I think part of it is that children can't speak out for themselves. And I think that's why right now we're hearing from our youth so strongly, because they have been ignored, because their interests have been ignored. And they're saying, you have to pay attention to us. You have to listen to us, because children can't speak out for themselves. They are dependent on us to speak for them. And you will see across the country, in fact, it's pediatricians who are really leading the public health movement for climate action to protect health, because we see it as our mission to protect children and speak for children.
Fascinating that pediatricians are leading the way along with their young, youthful clientele. That's interesting. It's also interesting, as you said, that MDs and medical professionals bring the climate change lens to their practice. Because I know back in the day, you did have the scientist or the environmental scientist and the medical scientist or medical professionals in silos. Mm-hmm. But I imagine they are all learning that is no longer an option.
Oh, no. Climate change is in our office now on a regular basis. Just today, I saw a family who the daughter, the young girl, I think she was about 8 years old, was suffering from allergies. And her mother said, my allergies just keep getting worse. And my daughter, now I have to treat her on 3 different medicines this fall. Why do I need to give so many medicines? And these opportunities, and I explained to her how well allergies are getting worse. And these connections present themselves in our office now on a regular basis. You can no longer ignore it.
And I want to move just a little bit for a few minutes on health impacts from climate change a little closer to home in Texas. Tell us about the impact of climate change on human health in Texas. And then the other thing I'd like to know is there a state or an area of the country that you think perhaps is more affected by health impacts of climate change?
Sure. Well, Texas, I know you are experiencing a longer summer. You have the hot days, which are continuing later into the fall, right? So 95-degree days are now 95-degree days occurring later. You're having more days above 100 degrees. And you may also have heard recently that warming temperatures can contribute to contamination of water supplies. For example, with the Naegleria fowleri, the amoeba that can grow in warm temperatures, which recently affected a child in Texas who passed away from that.
Tragically. That brain illness, yes.
Yes, yeah. So your longer summers also mean longer mosquito season. So whereas you might not have had to worry about mosquitoes in October, as the mosquito season extends with more heat, you have to worry more about that later than you did in the past. Now, I will say that Texas also carries the distinction of being the U.S. leader in wind energy.
Yes.
And that's a great success story for your state. I understand that the wind energy that Texas is producing is bringing you in $50 billion in revenue, and you are saving 49 million tons of carbon a year, which is the equivalent of 10 million cars.
We are, but the problem is they still can't let go of the legacy energy of oil and gas.
Well, it's certainly a process. This transition away from those is taking time, but it's important to look at the success and see it's a winner for the economy, it's a winner for our health, and it's a winner for our environment. That those are not inseparable, that they're not mutually exclusive. Our economy is not exclusive of our health, the health of our planet, or of our families, that we can have it all.
It is. We just have to get the oil and gas producers to understand they can make just as much money for just as long a time by moving to wind energy so that we can breathe better. Makes a difference. Thank you so much, Samantha. One last thing before we go, we just have just a minute, and that is, what can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions to some of these climate change health issues, especially as it relates to our children?
Absolutely. There's something that each of us can do every day, whether it's the choice of riding a bicycle or walking to a destination instead of driving. That's good for your health. It's great for the health and the mental health of children. Whether we make choices to bring our own bottles with us, you produce less plastic waste. Whether we decide to take bigger action to support clean energy policy in your city, walkable communities in your city, or even on the larger scale, on the state level or on the national level. So I think each of us can take small actions every day, and these can lead us to bigger actions, which have even more impact.
Exactly. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your help in helping us to understand this and the valuable information that you've exposed us to. Thank you so much. We've been with Dr. Samantha Adhoot, and we really appreciate her. Thank you.
So much.
And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. Each of them can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Please join us again next week as we continue our conversation on global warming and climate change. Thank you.